So something that's really exciting about 2021 with the Green Acreages program is that we actually have project funding. And this is related specifically to climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation, in the sense that we have our funding available to Land Stewardship Centre through the Alberta government's Watershed Resiliency and Restoration Program. So with the support from rural municipalities, the Green Acreages program is now able to support acreage owners 50-50 up to a maximum of $2,500 per project to lessen the impacts of flooding and drought on their properties, which of course, as we all know, is one of the things that is very much exacerbated by climate change, and is one of the things that we're seeing more and more of as we're experiencing the impacts of climate change in rural Alberta. And depending on what part of the province you're in, you might be experiencing one or both of these impacts. And so if that's the case and you are dealing with a water-related issue on your property, I would encourage you to look into this because this is available this year. We will be seeking to continue this project funding opportunity, but for right now, it's only available in 2021. We do have spots available for funding still, and it's a pretty easy process. So to apply for this fund, essentially the first step is to get your hands on a copy of the Green Acreages workbook that I just mentioned. So some of the application process you do need to have done, you need to have done a few of the chapters of the planning components of the workbook to prepare for your application. So either purchasing a copy of the Green Acreages workbook online or getting one from your county office is step one. Step two is choosing a project that suits your acreage. So all of the projects need to enhance or restore natural watershed function. And in my next slide, I'll talk a little bit more in detail about some of the eligible projects. But in a nutshell, we're working with the water instead of working against the water. So looking at slowing the water down if you have too much and sort of keeping it in place. And if you have livestock, keeping the livestock away from riparian areas is a big one that's absolutely eligible. And if you're doing any planting initiatives, we're really focusing on planting native species that will be hardiest to your area and will contribute to local biodiversity. And then step three is completing and submitting the online application form. And I will put, while Brenda is doing her presentation, I will put the link to that in the chat window so that everybody has access to it. So you can take a look at what that application form entails and what it looks like. And step four, if you are successful, you can receive up to $2,500 to lessen the impacts of drought or flooding on your property. Step five would be completing your project this summer or fall. And step six would be, of course, just enjoying your healthier property and sharing your success with others. So it's a pretty unique opportunity. We're the only organization that is providing funding for this kind of project in Alberta to acreage owners. So it's a very unique chance to get your hands on some funding to improve your property and to manage water in an environmentally friendly way. So some of the projects that are eligible, of course, they do have to enhance the natural watershed function. And we're looking at things like wetland and riparian zone enhancements. So if you have any wetlands or water bodies on your property, we're looking at the riparian zones there. So a riparian zone is sort of the edge of between the water and the land. So it's a very, very critical area in terms of water management, water quality, and also habitat and biodiversity. So riparian zones, that buffer between land and water, they help to slow down and filter the water, preventing flooding and reducing drought, but also they provide a ton of habitat and a lot of biodiversity. So anything that conserves or enhances a riparian zone would be eligible, or a wetland if you have a wetland on your property. For stormwater management, we're looking at things like erosion control. So if you have a slope, for example, doing some planting on a slope to reinforce it with roots, or even doing shoreline remediation or renaturalization. Other erosion reduction measures, if you have a stream or a creek on your property, you could do something called soil bioengineering, where you stake it with willow. And that also helps to establish a lot of roots that prevent erosion and sediments from going into the water and losing some of that bank. And then if you do have livestock, we're looking for project applications that would include things like exclusion fencing. So keeping your livestock out of the riparian zones and out of directly accessing your water bodies. So establishing any sort of off-site watering systems, we would be happy to fund those sorts of projects, or stream crossings where you're protecting the riparian zones and your water bodies in that way. And as I mentioned, we're a big fan of native species implanting. So if anybody here is interested in projects, I would love to hear from you. And these, of course, will help you to mitigate the effects of climate change on your property. So that's all I wanted to chat with you about with you today. And we would love for you to stay connected with the Land Stewardship Centre. And you can do that in a variety of ways. So we've got our mailing address here. It's kind of fun to still receive mail. I do get mail every once in a while, but you can always email me. It's just my first name, Milena, at landstewardship.org. And you can also hop onto our website, which is landstewardship.org, and sign up for the Grassroots News. This is our e-newsletter, and I write a lot of articles for this, as do all of my colleagues. And it's a great way to get a lot of information about stewardship initiatives that are going on around the province and different things that are happening. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And we would love to stay connected with you and support you in any way that we can in practicing stewardship on your acreages. So I'd love to answer any questions that you have. And I don't know if Marie would like to facilitate the Q&A.
Yeah, definitely. We might as well start with, there's a few questions in the chat box.
Sure.
So I'll ask you those questions first. And then if anybody has a question for Milena, just please unmute yourself and we can ask that way. And comments are welcome too as well. So questions or comments. So first question, it applies to offsite watering. So if you're on a well, does offsite watering system, does that still apply if you're on a well?
If you're on a well, that's a great question. If you're on a well, does offsite watering still apply? I guess I'm just looking at the chat right now. So this is a question from Tam. I guess the offsite watering, the impetus for the offsite watering would have to be somehow preventing the livestock from accessing a water body or a riparian zone. So you would have to be able to make the case for the offsite watering sort of mitigating a risk to a water body or a riparian zone. So if you're keeping your cattle or your other livestock out of an area that's a sensitive area, even if that is like a wetland or a damp area that could be, worked up by the trampling, you could definitely make a case for offsite watering in that way. But if it's just offsite watering from a well, I don't think that would be as strong of an application. Yeah, but that's a really good question that I had not considered. So thank you for asking it.
Yeah, definitely, for sure. The next question in the chat box is if someone that was interested in applying to this program, if they needed guidance about how to address enhancement and restoration, is that something that there's support for? So if they wanted a little bit more information about the how do I do this?
Absolutely. So thank you, Nicole, for that question. Absolutely, that is something that we have sort of built into the grant. So when you are applying for the grant, if there is a professional that you would need to consult for conceptualizing your project, you kind of have an area of your property that you'd like to address, an issue that you'd like to address, but you maybe need some help in the consultation department, you can build that into your proposal budget. You know, call around, get some quotes for how much that would cost. But we would recommend that you don't incur those expenses up front if you want to include them as part of your grant, because we do reimburse the expenses with receipts following a signed agreement. So just include the consultation expense as a budget line in your application. And then if your application is successful, then get the consultant or the landscaper or the biologist, whoever you need to come out to your property to help you out with your planning, to come out and give you an idea of what it's going to entail. And then you can even you can get reimbursed for that. If you feel like you need to do that beforehand, you can send me an email and we can see what we can do about covering that expense, you know, after the fact, because it might be really important in establishing the remainder of your budget if you're really unsure about what it's going to entail to do your project. So that might be one to email me about, but it is an eligible expense if you incur it after your application is approved.
Thanks very much, Milena. That's helpful.
Yeah, thank you. I have another question from Cam in the chat box. He's wondering how long this funding is available for.
So this funding, this round of funding, so we are applying for this funding. We will be applying for it again next year. So fingers crossed, we will hopefully have it again next year, but this funding is just available for 2021. So we would need all projects to be completed by the end of this warm season. So by the end of the fall of 2021. So if you're interested in doing a project with funding, we would encourage you to apply as soon as possible, so that because there are, of course, other applications coming in, I don't want anybody to miss out on the opportunity, but also so that you have time to complete your project this summer and fall on your property. Hopefully we will be able to extend this opportunity down the road into 2022, 2023 even, if we're successful in our own fundraising behind the scenes. But what we have secured right now is just for 2021.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone else have any questions? You can either pop them into the chat box or just feel free to unmute yourself and we can ask them that way as well.
And I just wanted to respond to A. Delaney's comment that yes, Red Deer County and Parkland County do have their own versions and we work with them. So if you are lucky enough to be in Red Deer County or Parkland County, you can apply to both Land Stewardship Centre and your county, and you have the possibility of receiving funding from both for projects. But there's also the opportunity, for example, we have some landowners in Red Deer County that wanted to do two projects, a water-related one and, for example, a pollinator garden. And they were able to get some funds for a a project related to water that was eligible under Land Stewardship Centre, and they were able to get some additional funds for a separate type of project through their county. So if you are in one of those two counties and you have a project that doesn't fit under a flooding and drought sort of lens, I'd encourage you to check out the program that you have available to you through your county.
Okay, yeah, that's really great advice. Thank you. Does anyone else have a question? I have a question. If nobody else has one, maybe I'll give everyone a chance, if they are feeling shy, to work up the courage to ask you if they do have a question. So I'm just kind of wondering, in your work with acreage owners, what do you think are the biggest concerns that acreage owners have about when it comes to climate solutions and their properties?
I think what I've been hearing anyways through the workshops. So one of the things I didn't mention in my presentation, and it's a significant component of my work through the Green Acreages program, is we also offer workshops. So if you are interested in learning more about the Green Acreages program, then you learn today and you'd like to get a free copy of the workbook as well, you can ask your county or your rural municipality to host a Green Acreages workshop, and then they would be providing the resources to you at no cost. So we do work with municipalities across the province to provide workshops. Of course, during the pandemic, they've all been over Zoom, but we have been getting a lot of feedback from acreage owners just that they want to manage their properties in a sustainable way, but they have a lot of different things kind of going on, and it's hard to decide where to start. And so what we do as one of the activities in the workshop is we do an asset mapping activity, and it's one of the first chapters in the workbook. And I really highly recommend everybody do this if you have never done it for your property. You basically take an aerial photo of your property and you map out all of the natural and physical assets that you have. So everything from fence lines to wetlands to stands of trees to your buildings to, you know, everything that you've got, because everything that is on your property contributes to the overall value of your property. And then you can sort of start to map out areas where you might have opportunities to improve your property, and start to map out where you might want to prioritize a project over another. And what we heard from people is that really helped them to start thinking about it in a more systematic way, what they can do right now, what they can take on, what's a manageable project that they can start with, and sort of going from there. And I think too, liaising and connecting with more experienced acreage owners on what they've been successful with is really beneficial. So connecting with people like Brenda, who have a lot of experience in managing their properties, and hearing, you know, their success stories and what we can learn from each other is really beneficial. But in terms of climate specifically, it really varies, Maureen. It kind of varies from one region to another. A lot of water issues, a lot of flooding, and then drought, depending on where we're at.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's such a great answer too. I think for any project, sometimes the hardest thing about it is knowing where to start. So that's so great that you have that resource for people to kind of figure out and prioritize where to start. That's really great. Does anyone else have any questions? I don't see anyone jumping to ask questions, and I don't see anything new in the chat box. So I think with that, I will thank you so much for your time and for answering our questions. That was such a great presentation. So thank you. And Brenda, I think I will things over to you now. So Brenda's going to be chatting with all of us about overgrazing and how to identify it on your pasture.
Perfect. Hi, everybody. Can you see my screen okay now?
Yes, yeah.
So I'm taking a slightly more positive take than the way Marie framed it, in that I'm hoping to not, I didn't mean to already be on the next slide already. Oh, it's just playing itself. That's lovely. Sorry about that. I want to talk more about, I guess, grazing to avoid overgrazing and not focus only on, I guess, the problem, but how do we avoid the problem? Hopefully this won't keep changing on me. A little bit about me and my husband, more Earthworks Farm. We're in central Alberta, just east of Lacombe, on actually lands that we have taken over and have taken over in succession from his mother. But both of us were farm kids who grew up in central, or I was farther east, who left the farm and tried to get as far away from it as we could. And then all of a sudden, 10 years, here we were back together. And out of our marriage, which is the picture in the top left there, our love for food, healthy, good, nourishing food, and having land access also then emerged a farm, as well as a now 7-year-old. And so really, you know, we maybe are similar, you know, to some of the acreage owners Milena was talking about that are coming to her, in that really it was about, if we have land and we're on this land, how do we manage it in the best way possible from a future looking point of view and stewarding the land. And for us, that was then about really looking at producing food using, it was already pasture-based, and everything had been put back to perennial. So how do we really maintain that perennial ecosystem? So that's been for us being primarily a protein production operation. So always cows and sometimes poultry and pork. But we have had different people come and kind of put different operations on our place temporarily. So our land has seen goats in the last 10 years, as well as bees and some other diverse enterprises that way. We are, I think, probably not considered an acreage. Under our management, we have approximately 100 acres. There's quite a bit of easements on our place too. So it's actually kind of across 3/4 sections, but it's about 100 acres across those 3 that we have from an agricultural purpose. So once you take out the buildings and the easements and those different elements, we've got 100 acres where we can actively produce off of it from an agricultural standpoint. So we're small for a farm and big for an acreage. But really, as I start to talk about this, I think it's a lot about the principles and the paradigm of how we look at our land and how we want to work with it, regardless of what size and scale we have. So I put this up as much for me, so I'm not constantly looking at my notes in my book, as well as it's something better than me to look at. But I guess, why care? Why care about grazing and overgrazing? Don't we want to, if we've got grass, why not get as much of it into the animals? But really, it doesn't always work that way. From a short-term point of view, that might seem very productive, but actually, we've really even seen on our place that as we manage, even from an animal production and the best value from our pastures for us as actual farmers, and I'll have some pictures here too, that if we graze in a way that actually the grass comes back even faster. And so one that's good for the animals, we can actually graze longer and get more out of small acres, feed for our animals, by actually managing it in a way that we're kind of leaving, it looks like we're leaving a lot behind, but actually it allows for even more to come. But and really that comes into the why of how that happens is a lot of the soil health piece. So if you think about what we see growing on top, that, you know, there's 2 elements, and that actually indicates what's happening below. So there's been some really amazing pictures. I don't have any on our place because we haven't done any big drilling, but where they really show that the root system of a perennial based system is going to go a lot deeper and a lot wider, and allow that even for the biology and the mycelium and all the variety pieces that we know are starting, and the science is starting to really show fit together to even to have a chance to take hold and have a chance to really work cooperatively in that perennial-based system to have healthier soil that then is going to actually support the next season's growth or even the growth of that season, compared to the more we graze down, the less on top, those are solar panels. That's nature's solar panels, is whatever is on top. So the less it's on top, the less it can take the energy from the sun and put it down below and feed the soil. And so if you really want to get into that, we had an excellent webinar about 6 weeks ago with Chris Nichols, who's the expert in this. And she really talks about that need, about the biggest thing we can be doing around soil health is just keeping things as green as long as we can. And she really, I love the way she challenges us to think about that in our more northern climate. And it is possible. I've seen green growing actually through the snow with some of our perennial plants and that kind of a piece there. Which then, that's soil health as well as that's the carbon sequestration. So studies are starting to show, we think of carbon sequestration, we think of the trees, which is true because they're pulling, but once a tree has grown, it's actually not pulling that much carbon anymore out of the atmosphere because it's kind of done growing. So it's locked it in, and as long as we leave it there, that's great. But if we want to actually be thinking about pulling even more, which is part of our challenge right now, is pulling the excess that's out from the ecosystem that these plants and that we have evolved in. There's studies that are really showing about the perennial grasslands and how actually they're an amazing carbon sink because they're constantly alive. It goes back to that having, the more green we have, the more that's active carbon sequestration. And where is it locking it? It's locking it into the soil. This piece of resilience. So Milena was starting to talk about this, and their program is really getting at this, is our ability to adapt and to face, we can't control the weather anytime as a farmer, let alone in an age of a changing climate and changing patterns. And so we've really seen, by managing our grazing effectively and making sure we've got ground cover, so we can't see bare soil, but also that root system deep into the soil, that's our protection around both erosion, whether that's wind in a drought, because if it's on top of the soil and there isn't bare dirt to blow away, we don't have a lot of topsoil where we're at, so we're not going to lose it anymore. I'm right by Buffalo Lake, and we have some pretty beach sandy that has been dug up and really surprised even some agricultural specialists that we knew we had sandy soil in this area from the mapping, but we literally have some prime beach sand if anybody's looking to develop their beachfront property. So we want to keep that covered, but also water erosion. We think of these massive, we think of flood, right? We think of water moving across the top as water erosion, but actually what can happen is you can get sheet erosion where we get a really heavy, nice, lovely rain. It doesn't look like there's erosion happening across the surface. It's not a flood, but actually the water will continue to move through. It's groundwater and it wants to move, to the lower area, back into the creeks, back into the sloughs. So it's moving through the soil. And if the soil doesn't have roots there, the soil is going to keep actually going with the water. And if you're in hills and that kind of thing, you can actually have sheet erosion happening with water, even when you don't realize that there is no flood. So again, having that root system. So if we overgraze, again, if we take whatever we take away from the top isn't going to be there in the bottom. So by allowing more to be on the top, we're allowing those root systems to be there and allowing them to develop. And this goes in then even the resilience piece of having a mix. So we have seen through both, some in the last 5 years, both some pretty serious droughts in our area where, we were really having to manage to make sure we had enough food and we weren't being too hard. By having even that mix of forages and grasses and legumes in our mix and in our perennials, then different things are going to flourish dependent on different circumstances. But again, we want to make sure they can thrive and be there when we need them and that we're not abusing them in the good lush puns. So really, what do we want to see? So we want to see ground cover. So whether ideally green, but we don't always have green in Alberta. But so some of this is we're leaving stuff behind. So that when we walk through our pasture, it's really hard. The goal is that it's really, really hard to see dirt and soil. We want to see the green, or we even want to see brown. We want to see a bit left behind because even that, given the opportunity to decompose, feeds the soil. as well as prevents the erosion. And like I've said, new green growth is what we're always looking for. And that comes into our management system. But I guess a principle that Jim Garrett, who does a lot of teaching around grazing and management from a very large scale point of view. I did a pasture walk with him about 7 years ago. And I'd heard it before, but he really, you know, here's this expert, we spent 5 hours, but he just kept talking and he kept pointing it out. That you don't overgraze a field, you overgraze a plant. So I can't stand here and look out 100 meters away and really tell you have I overgrazed. Because from here, it might look like there's a lot of stuff out there. But think of, well, when we finally can go back to buffets in restaurants or have, you know, big family meals, do you walk past a buffet and make sure, maybe some of us do, I'm a little bit that person because I feel a little bad, but, and take an equal proportion of every single dish in the buffet? Or do you maybe walk around and take a peek at which of your favorite dishes are out there first and make sure you get them, especially if they're hot and tasty and just come out of the kitchen, right? I'm gonna admit, I'm even though I try to take a little bit of everything because I hate to see stuff being left, even though, yeah, I do, I look, and that just came out of the kitchen, that's gonna be nice and hot and tasty, I'm gonna go take that. And even if I've already had some of that, if I see it came out of the kitchen again, and I go back for seconds, I'm probably still gonna have a little bit more of my favorite food, not think, well, I already had a portion, and you know, I'm trying to think of it, I don't want to put down anybody's favorite foods, but like the fresh, you know, carrots are over here versus the whatever, you know, and go back only for the things that I haven't had. And animals are just the same. We'll open up a new fence and the cows, it's like they almost walk all the way across all the fresh grass, sensing what's out there. And then they go to their favorite things. And a lot of that favorite will also be what's that new growth. And so they might have, you know, today they came by and they took a bite of their favorite plant. Well, that plant right away starts growing. So there's new growth there. And cows aren't, and most animals, even humans, we're not going to go, oh, well, I should leave that a little longer. Nope, that just came out of the kitchen. That's hot, that's tasty, it's fresh. I'm going to go back and eat that, even though I might have a field full of other plants. And so that's really that piece of realizing we overgraze plants. Even if there's thousands out there in the paddock we've given. It's about overgrazing a plant versus a field. Because then if I overgraze the plants and they overgraze the favorites, those die back, I have bare ground. More of, if you get into plant succession, more of the plants that we call weeds are probably going to take over that bare ground because that's their job in nature. It's to move in and cover that ground up. But then we've got more plants that aren't as lush, aren't as green, our animals don't want to have them, don't tend to be annuals as well, so don't have that deep root system, the same as if we get our perennials established and we let them thrive. So that's, I guess, to me, one of those key pieces that if I can have people who are helping me manage the farm when we have apprentices, know that and use that as our sensing and out there. So that it means every day, and sometimes right now when it's super hot, we're out there every day thinking, you know, 2 or 3 times perhaps, just watching, going, do we need to give them more? And you know, even though it's kind of nice to give them more because then theoretically I can go a couple days without having their cows, that isn't, they're not going to equally graze. They're not an electronic mower that just equally takes everything down, right? So it theoretically might save me some time, but actually what it's doing is taking away my productivity. And so just, you know, speaking to this time of year, grazing fast and growing fast. So the grass is growing fast. And so we only have 100 acres, which is fairly small, but we only have about 65 head out there right now of animals. And so we're moving them in smaller portions across the pasture because we want green grass. I don't want it to go to seed because once the plant goes to seed, it feels like it's done for a while and then it's going to turn to brown. But if we have the cows go along, graze that off, or goats, or even when we're using chickens, because we're fully pasture-based, they take off that plant wants to continue to grow, which means it's going to continue to grow roots, it's going to continue to sequester carbon, it's going to continue to feed the soil. So right now, kind of a principle for us is grazing fast because it's growing fast because we got a bunch of rain and now we've had heat because I don't want things going to seed, especially only in June. And so that methodology would be called top grazing. So it's really like you're just grazing across the top. And even though a grass stand might, look like, oh, but there's 2 or 3 more good bites before it looks like, before I could see the ground, before that principle kicks in. What I know I'm doing is I'm taking off that top and I'm allowing it time to recover. So we'll come back potentially to some parts of our pastures 2 or 3 times in a one season because we're managing it that way. So that's where that extra productivity comes in. And so I've talked about also having that mix of forages and grasses and legumes. 1 second, I need to ask my colleague.
Looks like we have a little cameo.
Turn down the sound. You can be here, but you got to turn down. Thank you. Yes. And so how we do this also, one of the things we want to do is these portable flexible systems. So Milena spoke about some of these water systems allow us to make sure the cattle aren't going down into the water areas, but it also means even that they're not always coming back, even if it's a well system. So we've really built kind of a principle of our management is always portable, flexible systems. So we're moving water, shelter, mineral, feed, whatever it is that the animals need. We're moving them to the perennials and everything else comes to the animals. And I'll show you some pictures there of how we're doing that. And so really for us, fencing is our friend. Both there's the permanent fencing to keep the neighbors happy, but we use a lot of electric fencing. And that's for our poultry, for our pigs, the goats also were managed with electric fencing and electric netting. And there's way more tools out there now and diverse tools related to fencing than when we started 10 years ago. We actually imported quite a bit of stuff from the States because there just wasn't a supply yet here in Canada. And I feel like I've taken already all my time, but I just will go through. So you can see this is, I'm standing in the same spot. The picture on the left here that you see my shadow is that's where the cows were for one day. And I literally just turned around and took a picture and that's where they were going. So in a way, you can see there's a lot left behind. But that actually is what's gonna feed the grass because it's only June. So we'll be back here potentially at the beginning of August or even the end of July, depending on how much rain we're getting. And we don't have, massive stands like they have some places, so we need to. So again, just similar, you can see kind of a line, maybe. I can see the line, I'm not sure if other people's eyes are at that point, but you can kind of see a line where I've just rolled up that wire. And so this is what we're using. So it's just really allows me, and it allows us to be really adaptable because we're using portable fences too. To go like, it being so hot, we do have some very mature tree stands that we can now graze into without harming the trees too much, especially because they're only going to be there a day. And that's our shelter. So when it's 32, I want to make sure I'm managing both that they've got grass, they got water, but they also even have shelter. Portable water systems. So I just thought this is a great thing to look at. The one on the right here, the aquamat, that's a dugout. And a man-made dugout, that's not a riparian area that looks all horrible, but we are also letting the grass come back. Part of the reason why this edging here does look is because it had been used for quite many years, allowing animals to just go right to the water area. So what we've got now is these are actually frost-free, so they can work in the winter as well because they work on vacuuming and the science behind it. My husband would love to explain to you. But basically, you can see now where it's worn because the cows have been trained that they pump it with their nose and the water siphons up. And so you can see the edge of it, so the hose is way over here and we've just got it pulled in from the fence line because we're not using this one right now. The cows have moved on, but I just was driving by and took a picture of this. So it's got a fairly long hose, which allows us, again, move the water to the different paddocks where the cows are at versus them. Sure, we've given them grass way over here, but then they're walking back and they'll graze along the way, right? Oh, on the way to the bathroom, I noticed, they just put up new fresh ginger beef from the kitchen. I'm gonna stop by on my way back and get some of that fresh, even though I'm full, even though I don't really need it. And there are a couple other waters that we just made. And so you can see it's just literally a plastic barrel that's been cleaned out. It was food grade that we were able to get, bolted onto these mats. The mats are handy because then the cows stand on them. And so then if they nudge the waterer, but they're standing on the mat, they can't tip it over. This is an actual float. This is, you can see, a man-made float with a water empty jug. And we bought the float system. So again, it's kind of like your toilet system. Just means that as the water fills up, then it cuts it off so it doesn't overflow. So fairly, and for pigs and goats, we had others like this, like the white one, we just cut them down. So they're at whatever level the different animal needs. And then there's this one as well, which is our main one that we've been using. And you can see it just similar, it's a cube. We've cut it back, there's the float. This is the back part of it where the hose hooks in. So again, we've got different lengths of hoses. Our place, this is well water that it'd be going, but my mother-in-law had designed the whole system so it goes out across, and then there's just different points. So as we're moving to different, I'm tapping in, but then I can also move this water around with different lengths of hoses, and it just drags behind our ranger here, and then that's how I can move it. But like I said, the principles kind of once you start to get it, to me fits any type of animal. I mean, you have to think about obviously what their needs are specific around food, water, shelter. But that flexibility, that portability, the, you know, us raising pigs and chickens, they are pasture-based. And for us, it's always been that moving them along, one, for their own health, because then they're not just sitting in one spot where they poop, but also making sure that they're fertilizing the pasture as we go forward and not damaging the pasture, not sitting in one place too long, that they're actually killing them. So it's not necessarily overgrazing, but it's that still, because they don't graze as much, but just making sure that we're maintaining that perennial system. We're maintaining the ability for green to grow up so that we've got roots going down, feeding the soil, sequestering carbon, ensuring erosion is at a minimum. And that's that. That's me.
Thanks so much, Brenda. It was great to have those visuals at the end there, some of your watering systems. Super handy. Does anyone have any questions for Brenda? Oh, here's a question that just popped up in the chat box. Brenda, do you have suggestions for restoring an overgrazed pasture? So one that's recently been acquired that's been overgrazed.
I guess it's probably really thinking of, you know, going back to that cycle that I had in there is really the plan to look at it again, just keeping your eyes on it. I mean, you can always, depending on what you're seeing, but from that overgrazed point of view, some of the signs of overgrazed are things like thistle and different weeds. Can you bring in animals? So I guess my biggest thing would be don't feel like you can't graze it. It's how do you use the grazing to even restore the ecosystem? Because assuming I'm in a prairie parkland ecosystem, this ecosystem evolved with grazers. And we actually have some of our easements are no graze, and we're seeing actually them move into a stagnation. So they've not been overgrazed, they've actually been undergrazed. So again, like, you know, it might be giving, depending on the type of animal you're using, you want to get rid of some of those annuals. You want to get rid of, you know, managing them. You know, the goats, actually, part of our field was we brought this guy in with his goats and had him, it gave him certain areas we wanted him because they ate back some of the brush and they ate back some of the thistle. But again, it depends on the state of it. You may, and we have, when we took over some of the land management, we had some areas that were so overgrazed that we actually did break them up and reseed them. So, and that's where the cover crops can come in and that kind of thing. And so we broke them up. We've used fall rye because it actually grows, like we seeded it late the fall and it grew and it was actually came in really quick. It's basically a cover crop. It will be an annual we have grazed it, but rather than it being, we're going to plow, we're going to get rid of those weeds just by leaving the ground bare and then try to restore the perennials, we've planted in both. So the fall rye came up quicker. We got that, again, that green solar panels working a lot faster than some of those perennial grasses because they take longer to take hold, but it is working with that succession piece. So depending, I mean, I'd love to talk more about that because it kind of depends on, you know, do you have animals? Do you already want to be using it with animals? Do you want to use tractor and mechanical? But you can use, you know, animals from that point of view, but it would be probably keeping them on their even shorter. So some disruption, but shorter, but then depending on what's already there, you may have to be introducing new seed and new seed bed. If it's already, there's, you know, perennials there, but they've been overgrazed. And so maybe it's just some of the brush is starting to take over, or you've got sage is a succession plant, absinthe, which is not a native, but has been lovingly introduced around our province, can, you know, be signs of that overgrazing. But we've seen some spots with the management, then we basically put the animals on those spots and leave them eat it. It's kind of like we just stopped refilling the buffet with the good stuff. So they got hungry enough, they ate some of the bad stuff down. So then we could come in from behind. So there are some techniques there from a sake of time, you know, and that's where maybe some really good advice, depending on where you are. Around the province, there are forage groups who really focus on this and the management of perennials and forage and have experts and have the advice, and that's what they're there for. Yes, they focus on sometimes the bigger farmers and are there for the farmers, but no one's ever asked me when I've showed up at a field day or a webinar how many acres I have under management and told me I didn't have enough and I couldn't beat it, right? So I would even reach out because they would also know it's a bit different. Sometimes we're in the gray wooded forage, the gray wooded soil class compared to if you're down in the foothills. Some of that management techniques are also going to be different.
That's super helpful, Brenda, especially to know that as a small, like we're around just over 100 acres ourselves. And so it does seem intimidating to have the forage groups who are the big guys. I wasn't sure if it would be amenable or useful. So thank you for that.
Yeah, that's really great advice. Good to remember about the forage groups for sure. And also good to know that, especially for new acreage owners, that if you do acquire property and it's been overgrazed, that it doesn't mean that you can't graze it. There are things that you can do. So that's great. Does anybody else have any questions for Brenda? Either pop them into the chat box or feel free to unmute yourself too. Okay, I'm going to take that as no more questions. So with that, I would like to thank Brenda for her time. And I'd like to thank Milena for her time as well today. Thank you both so much. And like I said at the beginning of today's talk, we will be recording this conversation and posting it to YouTube. So once I've done that, I will share an email with all of you so that you know that it's up there so you can refer back to it. If any of you have any questions that come up afterwards, feel free to reach out to me or Brenda or Milena. I think we've all had our contact info popped up here on the presentation at some point. And yeah, thank you everyone for your time as well. And thanks for your questions and have a great weekend. So take care, everybody.